Hey guys, tonight we begin with a medieval peasant named Thomas jolting awake in total darkness as his frozen toes remind him that winter doesn't care about your dreams. Picture this. You're sleeping on a pile of straw in a mud hut smaller than your bathroom, sharing space with a cow whose breath might be the only thing keeping you alive until morning. The year is 1347. And you probably won't survive this winter unless you master the brutal art of medieval endurance. From there, we'll journey to the glittering yet deadly courts of Tudor England, where Anne Boleyn plays the most dangerous game in history. Then we'll sail to Boston Harbor in 1773, where ordinary colonists are about to make tea the catalyst for revolution. Finally, we'll discover the lost civilization of Caral, where ancient Peruvians built pyramids in the desert 5,000 years ago, without a single weapon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bitter wind sliced through the gaps in the mud and stick walls like 1,000 invisible knives, each gust carrying the promise of death. Thomas jerked awake in the suffocating darkness, his body rigid with cold, his toes so numb they might as well have belonged to a corpse. The straw beneath him crackled like autumn leaves as he shifted, trying to coax feeling back into his frozen extremities. Beside him, his wife Margaret stirred restlessly, pulling their threadbare woolen blanket tighter around their 3 children, huddled between them. The youngest, barely 4 years old, whimpered softly in her sleep, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air of their one-room home. Welcome to Yorkshire, England, in the year of our Lord 1347, where winter wasn't just a season, it was a merciless judge that decided who lived and who became another silent grave beneath the frozen earth. Their home, if you could call it that, measured perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, constructed from whatever materials God and desperation had provided. The walls were wattle and daub, a technique that sounded far more sophisticated than it actually was. Thomas and his neighbors had woven thin branches between wooden posts, then slathered the gaps with a mixture of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. The smell never quite left, a constant reminder that survival often required swallowing one's pride, along with whatever meager supper could be scraped together. Thomas was 35 years old, though the harsh life of a medieval peasant had carved lines into his face that made him appear a decade older. His hands, permanently stained with dirt and calloused from endless labor, told the story of a man who had wrestled sustenance from reluctant soil since he could walk. Margaret, his wife of 12 years, possessed the kind of quiet strength that kept families alive when hope seemed as distant as the next harvest. Their children, William, aged 10, Mary, 8, and little Catherine, the baby, slept pressed against their parents, like cubs seeking warmth from their mother. But this winter felt different, cruel. The first snows had arrived in early November, weeks before anyone expected them, catching the village unprepared. Thomas had managed to store perhaps half the grain he'd hoped for, and their supply of firewood looked pitifully small when measured against the months of cold that stretched ahead like an endless frozen road. Every morning that he woke, with all his fingers and toes still responding to his commands, felt like a small miracle. But miracles, Thomas knew, had a way of running out just when you needed them most. The wind outside howled like the souls of the damned, rattling their wooden door and finding every tiny gap in their carefully constructed walls. Thomas could feel the cold seeping up through the dirt floor, a relentless enemy that no amount of straw could fully defeat. They had no glass windows, just a small opening covered with an oiled animal hide that kept out the worst of the weather, but little else. The darkness inside their home was so complete that Thomas couldn't see his own hand when he held it inches from his face. Margaret stirred beside him, her voice barely a whisper in the black air. "The wind's getting worse," she murmured, instinctively checking that all 3 children were still tucked safely between them. Thomas reached out to touch young William's forehead. It was cold, too cold, and the boy's breathing seemed shallow and labored. Fear gripped Thomas's heart like an icy fist. In a world without doctors, without medicine, without any of the comforts that might ease suffering, a simple cold could become a death sentence faster than a man could say his prayers. "We need more wood," Thomas whispered back. Though they both knew their small pile of precious fuel had to last until spring, or they would all freeze to death long before the first crocuses pushed through the snow. They also needed more food. The turnips and dried peas in their storage pit were disappearing far too quickly, and Thomas could already feel his belt loosening around his waist. But most of all, they needed hope, that fragile flame that kept burning even when everything else seemed lost. The storm outside intensified, and Thomas heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the steady drip of water somewhere above their heads. The roof, their shield against the fury of winter, was beginning to fail them. Each drop that fell into their home carried with it the promise of disaster. Wet straw meant cold straw, and cold straw meant death creeping closer with every passing hour. Margaret must have heard it too, because her hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones in a gesture that spoke of shared determination and love that refused to surrender to despair. Thomas closed his eyes and made a silent vow to whatever saints might be listening. He would do whatever it took to keep his family alive through this winter. He would share his last crust of bread, burn his last stick of wood, and give his last breath, if necessary, to ensure that come spring, Margaret and the children would still be there to see the world bloom again. But first, they had to survive this night, and the night after that, and all the brutal nights that winter had yet to throw at them. In the darkness of their tiny home, with the wind howling outside and death lurking in every shadow, Thomas held his family close and prepared to fight the greatest battle of his life, a battle not against armies or enemies, but against the ancient, implacable enemy of cold, hunger, and despair. The small ember of hope glowing in his heart was all they had, but sometimes, Thomas thought as he drifted back toward an uneasy sleep, sometimes one small flame was enough to hold back the darkness. Margaret pressed another handful of moss into the crack between 2 wooden posts, her fingers numb and clumsy in the morning cold. The moss was slightly damp from the night's frost, but it would help block the worst of the wind that seemed determined to find every gap in their humble walls. As she worked, something caught her eye in the corner where they stored their meager supply of turnips, a small gray form that hadn't been there the night before. She crept closer, her heart sinking as she realized what it was, a field mouse, frozen solid, its tiny body rigid as a stone. If the mice were dying, Margaret knew with the grim certainty of a woman who had survived 32 winters. This season would test them beyond anything they had endured before. Mice were survivors, hardy little creatures that could find warmth and food where larger animals perished. When even they succumbed to the cold, it meant the very air itself had become an enemy. She picked up the small corpse, offering a silent prayer for its soul, and tucked it into her apron. In times like these, even a frozen mouse might make the difference between a thin soup and no soup at all. The interior of their wattle and daub home reeked with the accumulated odors of winter survival. Unwashed bodies, smoke from their constantly struggling fire, the earthy smell of the mud and dung mixture that sealed their walls, and underneath it all, the musty sweetness of straw bedding that hadn't been changed in weeks. Margaret had long ago learned to breathe through her mouth when the smells became overwhelming. But this morning even that small comfort was denied her. The air was so cold that each breath felt like swallowing shards of ice. Margaret understood, perhaps better than her husband Thomas, that survival in winter was an art form requiring intelligence, creativity, and a willingness to abandon any notion of dignity or comfort. She was the keeper of 1,000 small secrets: how to make a handful of dried peas feel like a feast, how to stretch a single log to burn for an entire day, how to keep children warm when there were no blankets left to give them. These were not skills passed down in grand ceremonies or written in books, but whispered wisdom shared between women who understood that knowledge meant the difference between life and death. The food situation grew more desperate with each passing day. Their small store of grain, carefully rationed since autumn, was disappearing faster than snow in springtime. Margaret had already begun the grim mathematics of starvation. How many days could they stretch their remaining turnips? How small could she make each portion of porridge before the children began to weaken beyond recovery? She had taken to cutting each meal into ever smaller portions. That night, pressed against Bessie's warm flank with her children sandwiched between herself and Thomas, Margaret discovered something remarkable. The cow's breath, mingling with their own, created a pocket of almost bearable warmth in their tiny home. The animal's large body radiated heat like a living stove, and her steady breathing seemed to encourage a kind of peace that made sleep possible. It wasn't comfortable sleeping next to a 1,000-pound animal that occasionally shifted or relieved herself during the night. But comfort was a luxury they could no longer afford. Margaret's mind was already working ahead, planning and scheming with the desperate creativity of a mother determined to see her children live through winter. If Bessie could share their space, perhaps they could convince their neighbors to do the same. Old Henrik had 2 goats, and the baker's wife had managed to keep a pig alive through the autumn. If they could create a kind of community of warmth, sharing body heat and resources, perhaps they could all survive what was shaping up to be the coldest winter in living memory. She began to see survival not as an individual struggle, but as a collective art form. Tomorrow, she would speak to the other women in the village. She would share her knowledge of winter breathing, of layering clothes, of making animals into partners rather than just livestock. The frozen mouse in her apron reminded her that even the smallest creatures could teach lessons about the fierce determination required to face winter's worst assault. As Margaret drifted toward sleep, pressed against the warm flank of their cow, with her family safe around her, she allowed herself a moment of something that might have been pride. She was not just surviving, she was adapting, learning, becoming someone who could find warmth in the coldest places and hope in the darkest hours. The flame of their shared body heat, flickering but steady in the frozen darkness of their home, had grown from a single ember into something larger, something that could be shared and spread throughout their community. The sound that split the morning air was unlike anything Thomas had ever heard, a wail so raw and desperate that it seemed to tear holes in the very fabric of hope itself. Margaret dropped the bundle of kindling she had been gathering and ran toward the sound, her breath forming urgent clouds in the bitter air. Thomas followed, his heart hammering against his ribs as they approached old William's cottage, where Henrik the baker stood in the doorway. His face white as fresh snow, tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. Old William the Elder, 70 years of wisdom and stubborn determination, had finally lost his battle with winter. Henrik had found him that morning when he came to check on his elderly neighbor. a ritual that had become sacred among the villagers as the cold deepened. William lay in his straw bed, his weathered hands still clutched around the wooden cross his wife had carved for him before her own death 3 winters past. His small fire had died sometime during the night, and the cold had claimed him as gently asleep, but no less permanently. The village of Little Thornfield, normally bustling with the sounds of daily survival, had fallen into an eerie silence broken only by the whistle of wind through bare trees and the occasional crack of ice settling on thatched roofs. Smoke no longer rose from 3 of the cottages that dotted the frozen landscape, and Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If they continued to face winter as isolated families, each struggling alone against the merciless cold, there would be no one left to celebrate. When spring finally returned, William had been the village's memory, the keeper of stories and traditions that stretched back generations. He had survived famines, plagues, and winters that had claimed half the population. But this cold had proven too much even for his ancient resilience. As Thomas looked down at the old man's peaceful face, he saw not just death, but a warning written in frost and stillness. Winter was not just taking the weak, it was methodically working its way through anyone who faced it alone. Margaret knelt beside the still form, her fingers gentle as she closed William's eyes, and whispered a prayer that seemed to hang visible in the frozen air. "He shouldn't have been alone," she murmured, and Thomas heard in her voice the same realization that was crystallizing in his own mind. They could no longer afford the luxury of privacy or the pride that kept families separate. Survival demanded something that went against every instinct of independence they had been raised with: community, cooperation, and the willingness to share everything, even the most intimate spaces of their lives. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting in the cold, and looked around at the faces of his neighbors who had gathered to witness this latest tragedy. Henrik the baker, his wife Maud, young Peter the miller's son, Sarah, who had lost her husband to fever the previous summer and now struggled alone with 2 small children. Each face told the same story: exhaustion, fear, and the growing understanding that they were fighting a war they could not win as individuals. "We cannot continue like this," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the silent group with the authority of a man who had made a decision that would change everything. "William died alone, but he doesn't have to be the last. Tonight we gather, all of us. We share our fires, our food, our warmth. We stop pretending that winter cares about the walls between our houses or the pride that keeps us apart." The idea was radical, almost scandalous. Medieval life was built around the privacy and autonomy of individual families, even when those families lived in poverty. To suggest that they abandoned their separate homes and huddled together like animals went against centuries of tradition. But tradition, Thomas realized, was a luxury they could no longer afford. The frozen body of William the Elder was proof that the old ways were no longer sufficient. Henrik was the first to nod, his baker's hand still trembling from the shock of finding his dead neighbor. "My cottage is largest," he said quietly. "We have space for perhaps 3 families, if we don't mind sleeping close together." Sarah stepped forward next, clutching her children against her sides. "I have preserved meat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not much, but enough to share." One by one, the villagers began to contribute their resources to this desperate experiment in collective survival. That evening, as darkness fell like a heavy curtain across the frozen landscape, something unprecedented began to take shape in Henrik's cottage. Families arrived, carrying their most precious possessions: bundles of clothing, small stores of food, their few blankets, and in several cases, their livestock. The cottage that had housed 4 people that morning now sheltered 15 souls, and an assortment of animals that included 2 goats, a pig, and Margaret's cow, Bessie. The transformation was remarkable and immediate. The combined body heat of so many people and animals raised the temperature inside the cottage to something approaching bearable. Children who had been listless with cold began to show signs of life, playing quiet games in the corners while their parents organized sleeping arrangements and shared meals. The adults worked together with the efficient cooperation of people who understood that their survival depended on each other's success. Thomas found himself standing watch over the communal fire, feeding it carefully measured pieces of wood that came from the combined stores of all the families. The flame that had struggled to warm his own small home now blazed with new purpose, its light dancing across faces that had grown gaunt with hunger, but now showed the first signs of hope they had displayed in weeks. This was no longer just his fire, or Henrik's fire. It belonged to all of them, a shared symbol of their collective determination to survive. As the night deepened and the villagers settled into their makeshift beds arranged around the central hearth, Thomas listened to the sound of communal breathing, the soft snores of exhausted adults, the gentle sighs of children, finally warm enough to sleep deeply, and the rhythmic sounds of the animals that had become their partners in survival. Old William's death had shown them the cost of isolation, but in coming together, they had discovered something powerful. The flame of hope burned brighter when it was shared. Margaret, pressed close against his side with little Catherine between them, whispered words that would echo in Thomas's memory, long after winter had released its grip on the land. "One alone dies, but together we live," she said. And in those simple words, Thomas heard the birth of a new understanding about what it meant to be human in the face of nature's cruelest tests. The communal fire crackled and danced, its light holding back the darkness and cold, a beacon of shared warmth that would carry them through the long nights still to come. "I will be queen, or nothing at all." The words hung in the perfumed air of Hampton Court Palace like a challenge thrown down before God himself, spoken by a young woman whose dark eyes blazed with an ambition that would reshape the very foundations of England. Anne Boleyn stood before King Henry VIII in the summer of 1526, her slender fingers toying with the golden bee pendant that hung at her throat, a gift from her father that had become both her signature and her destiny. She was 25 years old, possessed of a beauty that was not classical but utterly magnetic, and she had just delivered an ultimatum that no other woman in the history of the English court would have dared to speak. The journey that brought Anne to this moment of breathtaking audacity began 25 years earlier at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, where she entered the world around 1501 as the second daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a man whose ambitions burned as fiercely as his daughters would come to do. The sprawling estate, with its red brick walls and towering chimneys, represented everything the Boleyn family aspired to: respectability, influence, and a place among England's elite that Thomas was determined to secure through careful strategy and advantageous marriages for his children. Anne was perhaps 6 years old when she first demonstrated the intelligence that would both elevate and ultimately destroy her. While her sister Mary played with dolls and practiced her needlework with the dutiful resignation expected of noble daughters, Anne peppered her tutors with questions that revealed a mind hungry for knowledge that extended far beyond the traditional feminine accomplishments of music, dancing, and household management. Her dark eyes, so different from the pale blue favored by English beauties of the time, seemed to absorb everything around her with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable and earned her a reputation as an unusual child. Thomas Boleyn recognized in his younger daughter a weapon that could be honed to cut through the barriers that separated his family from true power. In a world where women were valuable primarily as marriage pawns, Anne's quick wit and natural charisma represented opportunities that a clever father could exploit. When she was barely 12 years old, Thomas made a decision that would shape not only Anne's future but the future of England itself. He would send her to the continental courts of Europe, where she would receive the kind of sophisticated education that no English institution could provide. The first stop in Anne's European education was the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a glittering world of diplomacy, intrigue, and refined culture that opened the young girl's eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. Margaret, the regent of the Netherlands and one of the most powerful women in Europe, took a particular interest in the bright English girl who arrived at her court with letters of introduction from her ambitious father. Under Margaret's tutelage, Anne learned not just languages and courtly manners, but the subtle arts of influence and persuasion that would serve her so well in later years. The sophistication of the Netherlandish court was a revelation to a girl who had grown up in the relative provincialism of rural England. Here, Anne witnessed firsthand how intelligent women could wield power through charm, wit, and carefully cultivated relationships. She learned to speak French with the fluency of a native, mastered the complex etiquette that governed interactions between nobles, and most importantly, discovered that a woman with intelligence and determination could shape events rather than simply endure them. But it was Anne's time in France that truly transformed her from a clever English girl into a force of nature that would captivate a king and reshape a kingdom. When she was perhaps 15, Anne joined the household of Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I, entering a court that represented the pinnacle of Renaissance culture and sophistication. The French court was a theater of constant performance, where every conversation was a chess match, and every social interaction carried the potential for advancement or destruction. Under the guidance of Queen Claude, and later Queen Marguerite of Navarre, Anne absorbed lessons that no formal education could provide. She learned the art of conversation that could make men believe her opinions were their own ideas, the skill of flirtation that promised everything while giving nothing, and most crucially, the understanding that a woman's greatest power lay not in submission, but in the ability to make herself indispensable to those who held official authority. The French court's tradition of courtly love, where ladies were worshipped from afar and pursued with elaborate rituals of devotion, taught Anne that desire could be a form of control more powerful than any crown or scepter. The young woman who returned to England around 1521 bore little resemblance to the child who had left. Anne Boleyn, at 20, was a cosmopolitan sophisticate who could discuss philosophy with scholars, debate politics with ambassadors, and charm courtiers in 3 languages. Her style of dress, influenced by French fashion, emphasized her slender figure and drew attention to her most striking features, her long dark hair, her expressive hands, and those remarkable eyes that seemed to see everything and judge most of it wanting. More importantly, Anne had developed what could only be called presence, a quality that made people turn to look when she entered a room, that made conversations pause when she spoke, that transformed ordinary social gatherings into stages for her particular brand of magnetic performance. She was not the most beautiful woman at court. That distinction belonged to conventional English roses with fair hair and pink cheeks, but she was undoubtedly the most compelling, and in a world where attention was currency, Anne had learned to make herself rich beyond measure. When Thomas Boleyn secured his daughter a position as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, he believed he was simply advancing his family's interests through traditional means. What he could not have anticipated was that Anne would use this position not as a stepping stone to a suitable marriage, but as a platform from which to launch an assault on the very foundations of the English monarchy. The golden bee pendant at her throat, originally a symbol of family pride and paternal ambition, was about to become something far more significant, a declaration of war against the established order. In the elegant chambers of Hampton Court Palace, surrounded by the rituals and hierarchies that had governed English court life for centuries, Anne began to plan her revolution. She watched Queen Catherine, dignified and devout, but no longer young or capable of giving Henry VIII the male heir he desperately needed. She observed the king himself, magnificent in his power, but increasingly frustrated by the limitations that bound even absolute monarchs. And she began to understand that the right woman, with the right combination of intelligence, ambition, and strategic thinking, might be able to rewrite the rules that had governed royal marriages since time immemorial. The bee pendant caught the light as Anne moved through the corridors of power, learning the rhythms of court life while secretly preparing to shatter them completely. She had returned from Europe armed with weapons no English woman had ever possessed before, the sophistication to match any continental princess, the education to debate with theologians and diplomats, and most dangerously of all, the absolute conviction that she deserved to be more than just another nobleman's daughter, bartered away in marriage for political advantage. Anne Boleyn had come home to England, and England would never be the same again. "I beseech God daily that I might see you again, for I cannot live without you." The words, written in Henry VIII's own hand, trembled with a passion that had already begun to consume not just a king, but an entire kingdom. The letter, one of 17 that would survive the centuries as testament to an obsession that would split England from Rome, lay sealed with the royal arms in Anne Boleyn's chambers at Hampton Court Palace. It was the spring of 1527, and the most powerful monarch in Europe was pleading like a lovesick boy for the attention of a woman who had mastered the art of keeping him forever at arm's length. Henry VIII, at 36, was a king accustomed to having his desires fulfilled before he could fully articulate them. Tall, athletic, and possessed of the kind of commanding presence that made men step aside when he entered a room. He had ruled England for nearly 18 years with a combination of charisma, intelligence, and barely controlled violence that had made him both feared and admired throughout Europe. His court was a glittering showcase of Renaissance magnificence, where the finest artists, musicians, and scholars competed for royal favor, and where the king's slightest whim became law before the words had finished leaving his lips. Yet this same king, who could order the execution of his closest advisors without a moment's hesitation, found himself reduced to a state of helpless longing by a dark-eyed woman who refused to behave according to the established rules of royal courtship. Anne Boleyn had returned to the English court with a sophistication that set her apart from every other woman in Henry's experience, and she wielded that difference like a weapon designed specifically to drive him to distraction. The setting for this revolution in royal desire was Hampton Court Palace, Cardinal Wolsey's magnificent creation that had become the unofficial center of English political and cultural life. Within its red brick walls, beneath ceilings painted with the symbols of Tudor power, the most important drama in English history was beginning to unfold. The Great Hall, where Henry held his most elaborate entertainments, became a stage where Anne performed a careful ballet of advance and retreat, drawing the king's attention while never quite allowing him to believe he possessed it completely. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been a political arrangement that had served its purpose for nearly 2 decades, producing one surviving child, Princess Mary, but failing to deliver the male heir that was essential for the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine, 6 years older than Henry, and possessed of the dignified piety that characterized Spanish royalty, had been a dutiful queen and a faithful wife. But she was no longer young, and the biological clock that governed royal succession was ticking toward midnight with each passing year. Into this atmosphere of dynastic anxiety came Anne Boleyn, carrying herself with the confidence of a woman who had been educated to believe she was worthy of the attention of kings. Unlike the other ladies of the court, who lowered their eyes and spoke in whispers when the king approached. Anne met Henry's gaze directly, responded to his compliments with wit rather than grateful stammering, and treated his obvious interest as an entertaining diversion, rather than the overwhelming honor it was supposed to represent. The transformation in Henry's behavior was both subtle and profound. A king who had previously satisfied his appetites with a series of discreet affairs, including a brief liaison with Anne's own sister Mary, found himself writing poetry, composing music, and spending hours crafting letters that revealed a vulnerability no one had suspected lay beneath his imperial facade. The golden bee pendant that Anne wore at her throat seemed to hypnotize him, drawing his attention in the middle of state ceremonies and diplomatic receptions until courtiers began to whisper about the king's obvious distraction. Anne's strategy was as brilliant as it was dangerous. When Henry offered her the traditional role of royal mistress, complete with titles, property, and a guaranteed place in court hierarchy, she delivered her response with the kind of cold precision that would have done credit to a military commander. She would not be another forgotten woman in the king's bed, she declared. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his queen, which meant the impossible would have to become inevitable. He would have to rid himself of Catherine and marry Anne, regardless of the political, religious, and diplomatic consequences. The audacity of Anne's demand sent shockwaves through the careful world of Tudor politics. Queens were chosen for their ability to forge international alliances, their proven fertility, and their unquestioned virtue. Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a mere knight who had risen through royal favor, had no royal blood, no guarantee of producing male heirs, and a reputation for independence that was the opposite of what medieval kings expected from their wives. Yet Henry, driven by a combination of genuine passion and dynastic desperation, began the process that would ultimately tear apart the religious and political fabric of his kingdom. The king's great matter, as the question of his marriage came to be known, consumed the court for the next 6 years. Henry dispatched scholars to scour ancient texts for precedents that might invalidate his marriage to Catherine, arguing that his union with his brother's widow had been cursed by God, evidenced by their failure to produce a male heir. Teams of lawyers and theologians were assembled to construct legal arguments that would convince the Pope to grant an annulment, while diplomats worked frantically to manage the political fallout that such a decision would inevitably create. Throughout this extended campaign, Anne maintained her position with the skill of a master chess player, advancing and retreating in perfect measure to keep Henry's obsession burning, while never quite allowing him to achieve his goal. She accepted gifts and honors, allowed herself to be established in increasingly elaborate apartments within the royal palaces, and permitted Henry to shower her with the kind of public attention that made their relationship impossible to ignore. Yet she consistently refused to surrender the one thing that would have satisfied Henry's immediate desires, using her virtue as both shield and weapon in a game where the stakes could not have been higher. The golden pendant at Anne's throat, originally bearing only the B that proclaimed her family identity, was joined by an H that Henry had commissioned as a symbol of their intertwined destinies. The two letters, crafted in precious metal and worn at the base of Anne's elegant neck, became a declaration of revolutionary intent that every observer understood, but none dared openly acknowledge. This was no longer simply a royal affair, but the visible symbol of a constitutional crisis that would reshape the relationship between church and state in England forever. As 1532 drew to a close, Anne's campaign of strategic resistance was nearing its culmination. Henry, driven to desperation by 6 years of frustration, had already begun the process of breaking with Rome, establishing himself as the supreme head of a new Church of England that would be free to grant him the annulment that the Pope had consistently refused. In November, during a diplomatic visit to Calais, Anne finally surrendered to Henry's desires, and within weeks she was pregnant with what both she and the king prayed would be the male heir that would justify all the upheaval they had caused. The secret wedding ceremony that took place on January 25th, 1533, marked the triumph of Anne's extraordinary gamble. She had successfully transformed herself from a knight's daughter into the Queen of England, forcing a king to remake his kingdom in order to possess her. The pendant at her throat now proclaimed not just her own identity, but the birth of a new England where the old certainties of papal authority and traditional marriage law had been swept aside by the force of royal will and feminine determination.
I am not afraid to die. I am only afraid of being forgotten. The words echoed through the cold stone chambers of the Tower of London on the morning of May 19, 1536, spoken by a woman who had once commanded the attention of kings and now faced her final dawn with the same fierce dignity that had elevated her to unprecedented heights. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for barely 3 years, sat in the same fortress where she had spent the night before her coronation. But this time she would leave only for the scaffold that awaited her in the courtyard below. The irony was not lost on Anne, that she would meet her end in the very place where she had been transformed from Thomas Boleyn's ambitious daughter into the most powerful woman in England. The Tower of London, with its ancient stones that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless nobles, had become both the symbol of her triumph and the stage for her destruction. The same chambers that had housed her in luxury as she prepared for her coronation now confined her as she prepared for death, and the same crowds that had cheered her procession through London's streets in 1533 would gather to witness her execution 3 years later. Anne's downfall had been as swift and shocking as her rise had been gradual and calculated. The woman who had forced a king to break with Rome and establish a new church now found herself accused of adultery, incest, and treason charges so monstrous that they seemed to belong in a nightmare rather than a courtroom. The evidence against her was laughably thin, built on the testimonies of men who had been tortured until they confessed to crimes that could not possibly have occurred given the timeline of Anne's heavily guarded daily life. Yet in Henry VIII's England, truth had become whatever the king needed it to be, and Henry needed Anne Boleyn to be guilty. The transformation in Henry's feelings toward his second queen had been gradual but inexorable. The passionate letters he had once written, pleading for her love, had given way to cold formality and barely concealed irritation. The birth of Princess Elizabeth in September 1533, rather than the male heir both parents had prayed for, had planted the first seeds of Henry's disappointment. Each month that passed without the longed-for pregnancy had chipped away at the foundation of their relationship until what remained was a marriage held together by political necessity rather than love. Henry's eye had already begun to wander to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose pale, submissive beauty represented everything that Anne was not. Where Anne was dark, sharp-tongued, and intellectually challenging, Jane was fair, quiet, and reassuringly conventional. The king, who had once thrilled to Anne's wit and independence, now found himself craving the kind of gentle, uncomplicated devotion that Jane promised to provide. The contrast between the two women became a daily reminder to Henry of what he had sacrificed for a passion that had cooled to mere tolerance. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister,
and once Anne's greatest ally in her rise to power, had recognized the shifting winds of royal favor with the instincts of a man who had survived the treacherous waters of Tudor politics longer than most. Cromwell understood that his own future depended on his ability to provide Henry with solutions to his problems, and by 1536, Anne Boleyn had become Henry's greatest problem. She had failed to produce a male heir, had made enemies through her support for religious reform, and worst of all, had retained the intelligence and independence that had originally attracted Henry, but now seemed to threaten his absolute authority. The charges assembled against Anne were a masterpiece of political theater designed to give Henry's desires the veneer of legal justification. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn, a charge so horrific that it ensured public support for her destruction. The supposed lovers included a court musician, Mark Smeaton, who confessed under torture, and several courtiers whose only crime seemed to be their friendly interactions with the Queen. The timeline of the alleged affairs was impossible, placing Anne in multiple locations simultaneously. But logic had little place in a trial whose verdict had been predetermined. Anne's trial at the Tower of London on May 15, 1536, was a spectacle designed to legitimize what was essentially a judicial murder. 26 peers of the realm, many of whom owed their positions to Anne's influence during her rise to power, sat in judgment of the woman who had once been their patron. The proceedings were conducted with all the ceremony and solemnity that English law required, but the outcome was never in doubt. Anne defended herself with the same intelligence and composure that had made her irresistible to Henry VIII, systematically dismantling the prosecution's case and exposing the contradictions in the evidence against her. Yet even as Anne spoke with eloquence and conviction about her innocence, she must have understood that her words were merely a final performance in a drama whose ending had already been written. The men who judged her included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who would condemn his own niece to death rather than risk Henry's displeasure. Her estranged husband sat as the supreme judge of her case, his presence in the courtroom a reminder that in Tudor England, royal marriages were ultimately political arrangements that could be dissolved as easily as they had been created. The verdict was delivered with the same inevitability as sunset, guilty on all charges. Anne would be executed either by burning or beheading, as the king might choose, though Henry's lingering affection, or perhaps his desire to appear merciful, led him to order the more humane death by sword. In a final gesture that revealed something of the man Anne had fallen in love with years earlier, Henry arranged for a French executioner to be brought from Calais, a swordsman whose skill would ensure a quick, clean death rather than the clumsy butchery that often accompanied executions by axe. Anne's final night in the Tower was spent in prayer and preparation, attended by ladies who had served her throughout her brief reign and who now wept openly for the queen they were about to lose. She divided her few remaining possessions among her servants, wrote letters to be delivered after her death, and composed herself for the final act of the drama that had begun when she had first caught Henry's eye at Hampton Court. The woman who had once declared that she would be queen or nothing at all, faced the fulfillment of her prophecy with the same courage that had elevated her above every obstacle in her path. As dawn broke over the Tower of London on May 19, 1536, Anne dressed carefully for her execution in a gray damask gown trimmed with ermine. The colors of mourning and majesty combined in a final statement about the contradictions that had defined her life. The golden pendant bearing the intertwined B and H that had symbolized her union with Henry was removed from her throat, its work finished, its meaning transformed from promise to warning. In a few hours, that pendant would fall to the scaffold along with its wearer. But the revolution Anne had begun would continue to reshape England long after her voice had been silenced forever. The woman who walked to her death that morning carried with her the knowledge that she had achieved something unprecedented in English history. She had forced a king to choose between her and the established order of church and state, and for a time she had won. The daughter she left behind, the disappointment who had cost Anne Henry's love, would grow up to become Elizabeth I, the greatest monarch in English history, and a testament to the intelligence, courage, and determination that Anne had passed down through her blood, if not through her presence.
No taxation without representation. The cry echoed through the cobblestone streets of Boston on a gray December morning in 1773, reverberating off the brick facades of merchant houses and taverns, until it seemed as if the very stones of the city were shouting their defiance. The voice belonged to Samuel Adams, a man whose fierce gray eyes had witnessed the steady erosion of colonial rights for more than a decade, and whose lean frame trembled not with cold but with righteous anger that had been building like pressure in a kettle for years. At 51, Adams had devoted his life to the seemingly impossible task of convincing his fellow colonists that they were no longer Englishmen living abroad, but Americans who deserved to govern themselves. Boston Harbor stretched before him like a mirror reflecting the turbulent sky, its waters crowded with the masts and rigging of merchant vessels that had made this port the beating heart of New England's economy. The harbor had always been Boston's lifeline, connecting the growing city to the wider world through trade routes that stretched from the Caribbean sugar islands to the cod fishing grounds of Newfoundland. But now those same waters had become a battlefield where the fundamental questions of liberty and tyranny would be decided, not with cannons and muskets, but with crates of tea and the unbreakable will of people who refused to surrender their birthright as free men. The crisis that gripped Boston in the winter of 1773 had its roots in a decade of mounting tension between the American colonies and their mother country. What had begun as disagreements over taxation and trade policy had evolved into something far more dangerous, a fundamental conflict over the nature of political authority and the rights of subjects who lived 3,000 miles from the seat of power. The Tea Act of 1773, Parliament's latest attempt to assert its dominion over colonial commerce, had struck Boston's merchants and patriots like a declaration of war disguised as economic policy. Samuel Adams understood better than most that the Tea Act was not really about tea at all, but about the principle that would determine whether Americans would remain subjects or become citizens. The law granted the British East India Company a virtual monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, allowing the company to sell directly to retailers and bypass the colonial merchants who had built their fortunes on the tea trade. More insidiously, the act left in place the 3-penny tax on tea that had been imposed by the Townshend Acts, making acceptance of the cheaper tea equivalent to acknowledgement of Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. The political landscape of Boston in 1773 was a powder keg of competing loyalties and simmering resentments. On one side stood the Patriots, led by men like Adams, John Hancock, and Dr. Joseph Warren, who believed that the colonies had reached the point where submission to British authority meant the death of liberty itself. On the other side were the Loyalists, including royal officials like Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who maintained that resistance to lawful authority was treason and that the colonies' prosperity depended on their continued connection to the British Empire. Between these two extremes stood the vast majority of colonists, who wanted to remain loyal to the crown while protecting their rights as Englishmen, not yet ready to contemplate the radical step of independence. The arrival of 3 tea ships in Boston Harbor, the Dartmouth on November 28th, the Eleanor on December 2nd, and the Beaver on December 15th,
transformed this political crisis into an immediate, practical problem that demanded action. The ships rode at anchor, like floating symbols of British determination to force the colonies into submission, their holds packed with 342 chests of East India Company tea worth more than £10,000. Under British law, the ships had 20 days from their arrival to unload their cargo and pay the required duties, or customs officials would seize the tea and sell it themselves, effectively accomplishing, through bureaucratic force, what the colonists refused to accept through voluntary compliance. Samuel Adams and his allies in the Sons of Liberty, the secretive organization that had coordinated resistance to British policies since the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, immediately recognized that this was their moment of truth. They could not allow the tea to be unloaded, for that would establish the precedent that Parliament could tax the colonies at will. Neither could they allow the ships to leave with their cargo intact, for that would accomplish nothing and leave the door open for future attempts to force acceptance of the tax. The only solution was to destroy the tea itself. But such an action would cross the line from legal resistance to open defiance of royal authority. The Old South Meeting House, Boston's largest public building, became the center of a democratic experiment that would have been impossible in England itself. Day after day, thousands of colonists from Boston and the surrounding countryside packed into the wooden structure, their breath fogging the cold air as they debated the fundamental questions of liberty and allegiance. These were not the formal proceedings of Parliament or a royal court, but the rough and tumble democracy of men who believed that ordinary citizens had the right to determine their own fate. Farmers stood alongside merchants, artisans debated with lawyers, and Samuel Adams presided over it all with the skill of a conductor directing a symphony of discontent. The Sons of Liberty had learned from years of organizing resistance that successful political action required both careful planning and the appearance of spontaneous popular uprising. Throughout the crisis, Adams and his allies maintained a careful watch over the tea ships, posting guards to ensure that no one attempted to unload the cargo while negotiating frantically with ship captains and customs officials to find a solution that would satisfy both colonial demands and British law. The captains, caught between the colonial committees that controlled the harbor and the royal officials who controlled their legal status, found themselves prisoners of a political crisis they had never expected to navigate. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a Massachusetts native who had spent his life serving the crown, represented the loyalist position with a dignity and determination that earned him the grudging respect even of his enemies. Hutchinson understood that allowing the ships to leave without paying the required duties would effectively nullify British authority in Massachusetts, opening the door to further acts of resistance that could spread throughout the colonies. His refusal to grant the ships clearance to depart without unloading their cargo was not merely bureaucratic stubbornness, but a calculated defense of the principle that royal governors, not colonial committees, held ultimate authority in His Majesty's dominions. As December 16th dawned cold and gray over Boston Harbor, the 20-day deadline for the Dartmouth approached like an approaching storm front. The accumulated tension of weeks of meetings, negotiations, and fruitless appeals to royal authority had reached the breaking point. Samuel Adams stood before the largest crowd in the Old South Meeting House's history, 7,000 people who had come to witness what they sensed would be a historic moment. His words, delivered with the calm precision of a man who had already made his choice, would echo through American history. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. In the galleries and on the floor of the meeting house, men began to stir with the kind of energy that precedes decisive action. The time for petitions and protests had passed. The moment had arrived for the kind of bold stroke that would either secure American liberty or bring down the full weight of British retribution on the heads of those who dared to defy the crown. Outside the meeting house, other men were already preparing for the night's work, gathering the disguises and tools they would need to transform themselves from respectable colonists into the agents of revolution. The dried tea leaves that had seemed like such a simple commodity when they left the plantations of India and China were about to become the seeds of a new nation. The war cry of the Mohawk pierced the December twilight like a blade cutting through silk, echoing across Boston Harbor with a wildness that made even the hardened sailors on the anchored ships look up from their evening duties. But these were not real Mohawks whose voices carried across the dark water. They were Boston's sons, merchants and artisans, laborers and clerks, transformed by soot-blackened faces and hastily donned blankets into symbols of a new kind of resistance that borrowed the imagery of America's original inhabitants to challenge the authority of its current masters. Griffin's Wharf stretched into Boston Harbor like a wooden finger pointing toward the 3 tea ships that had become the focal point of colonial fury. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver rode at anchor in the gathering darkness of December 16th. The choice to disguise themselves as Mohawks was not random, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of the symbolic power of political theater. By adopting the appearance of America's indigenous people, the colonists were rejecting their identity as British subjects and claiming instead an authentically American identity that predated European settlement. The Mohawk had been allies of the British in countless frontier wars, but they also represented a form of sovereignty that existed independent of European authority, making them the perfect symbol for colonists who were beginning to question their own allegiance to the crown. George Robert Twells Hughes, a shoemaker who would later become one of the most famous participants in the night's events, described the transformation with the wonder of a man who had witnessed something unprecedented in his ordinary life. "We were Indians," he would later write, "Indians from that moment, and as Indians we meant to act." The psychological effect of the disguise was as important as its practical purpose of concealing identities, allowing ordinary colonists to step outside their normal roles as law-abiding subjects and embrace the possibility of direct action against royal authority. The organization of the operation reflected months of careful planning by the Sons of Liberty, who had learned from previous acts of resistance that successful political action required both secrecy and coordination. The men were divided into 3 groups, each assigned to one of the tea ships, with leaders who had been selected for their ability to maintain discipline and prevent the action from degenerating into a riot. Joshua Wyeth, a journeyman blacksmith, led one group. Thomas Melville, a merchant, commanded another, and Samuel Sprague, a ship's carpenter whose knowledge of maritime operations would prove invaluable, took charge of the third. As the disguised colonists made their way through Boston's winding streets toward the harbor, the city itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Windows were shuttered, taverns fell silent, and even the dogs that usually barked at strangers seemed to sense that something momentous was about to occur. The temperature had dropped as darkness fell, and the men's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as they moved with the purposeful silence of a military operation conducted in the heart of enemy territory. The approach to Griffin's Wharf required careful timing and coordination, as the conspirators needed to overwhelm any resistance before word could be sent to the British warships anchored nearby, or to the royal officials who might order troops to intervene. The element of surprise was crucial. Once aboard, the colonists' behavior reflected both their determination and their respect for property rights that extended beyond the hated tea. Nothing was stolen, no personal belongings were touched, and the ships themselves were treated with the care due to valuable property that belonged to fellow colonists rather than the British government. When one participant was discovered attempting to pocket some of the tea for personal use, he was roughly handled by his companions and warned that their action was a political statement, not an excuse for theft. The work of destroying the tea began with an almost ritualistic solemnity that belied the revolutionary nature of the act. The 342 chests, each weighing approximately 400 pounds and containing some of the finest tea leaves in the world, were hauled up from the ship's holds with block and tackle. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the harbor as the men broke open the chests with hatchets and tomahawks, releasing the distinctive aroma of high-quality tea into the cold night air. The destruction itself was systematic and thorough, reflecting the colonists' understanding that this was not a spontaneous riot, but a carefully planned political demonstration. The tea was dumped overboard in a steady stream that turned the dark waters of Boston Harbor into a vast aromatic soup. Some of the lighter tea leaves floated on the surface, creating patches of brown that spread outward from the ships like stains, while the heavier debris sank immediately to the harbor bottom, where it would remain as a permanent monument to the night's defiance. The entire operation took approximately 3 hours, during which time the participants maintained almost perfect discipline and organization. No one was injured, no property except the tea was damaged, and the ships were left in better condition than many of their crews had maintained them. When the work was finished, the men carefully swept the ship's decks clean, returned borrowed tools to their proper places, and even replaced a padlock that had been accidentally broken during the boarding. As the last of the tea disappeared beneath the dark waters of Boston Harbor, the men who had destroyed it stood for a moment in silence, perhaps sensing that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The dried leaves that now formed a brown stain spreading across the harbor represented more than 10,000 pounds worth of property. But their real value lay in what their destruction symbolized: the rejection of British authority and the birth of an American identity that would no longer accept the status of colonial dependence. The symbolic power of tea leaves floating in Boston Harbor that night would prove more explosive than gunpowder, transforming a local dispute over taxation into the opening act of a revolution that would reshape the political landscape of the entire world. Boston has crossed the line. The words exploded from King George III's lips with a force that made his courtiers step back in alarm, their powdered wigs trembling as the monarch's face flushed crimson with rage. The news of the Boston Tea Party had crossed the Atlantic in January 1774, carried by swift merchantmen whose captains understood that information about colonial rebellion was worth more than any cargo in their holds. In the gilded chambers of St. James's Palace, where portraits of conquered enemies gazed down from silk-covered walls, the destruction of 10,000 pounds worth of East India Company tea had struck the British government like a physical blow to the very foundations of imperial authority. Lord North, the king's chief minister, stood before his sovereign with the careful composure of a man who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal temperament during times of crisis. Frederick North was not a man given to dramatic gestures or inflammatory rhetoric, but even his usually measured demeanor reflected the gravity of the situation facing the British Empire. The colonies, which had been a source of pride and profit for generations, had become a festering wound that threatened to infect the entire body politic with the dangerous notion that subjects could choose which laws they would obey and which they would reject with impunity. The reaction in London was swift and decisive, driven not merely by anger, but by the calculated understanding that failure to respond to such blatant defiance would invite similar acts of rebellion throughout the empire. The East India Company, whose financial difficulties had prompted the Tea Act in the first place, demanded immediate compensation for their losses and punishment severe enough to deter future acts of resistance. More importantly, the principle of parliamentary supremacy itself was at stake. If colonists could destroy British property without consequence, then the authority of Parliament and the Crown would become mere suggestions rather than law. The response that emerged from the corridors of Westminster would become known to Americans as the Intolerable Acts, though Parliament preferred the more measured title of Coercive Acts. The legislation represented the most comprehensive assertion of British authority over colonial affairs since the founding of the American settlements. Designed not merely to punish Boston, but to serve as an example to any other communities that might be tempted to follow Massachusetts down the path of resistance. The Boston Port Act, the first and most devastating of the punitive measures, struck at the very heart of New England's economic life. Effective June 1, 1774, Boston Harbor would be closed to all commercial traffic until the destroyed tea was paid for, and order was restored to the satisfaction of royal officials. The law was crafted with surgical precision to inflict maximum economic damage, while appearing to offer a reasonable path to reconciliation. All the colonists had to do was pay for the tea, submit to British authority, and Boston could resume its role as the premier port of New England. The economic impact was immediate and catastrophic. Boston's merchants, who had built their fortunes on the steady flow of goods through the harbor, watched helplessly as their livelihoods evaporated overnight. Ships that would normally have crowded the wharves with their cargoes of rum, sugar, timber, and manufactured goods were forced to seek alternative ports, carrying their business and the jobs they created to New York, Philadelphia, and other cities that remained in British favor. The city that had been the beating heart of New England's economy became a ghost town of empty warehouses and idle workers. The Massachusetts Government Act struck an even deeper blow at colonial self-governance, systematically dismantling the political institutions that had allowed Massachusetts to govern itself for more than a century. The colonial charter that had guaranteed certain rights and privileges was effectively revoked, replaced by a new system in which the royal governor would appoint all judges, sheriffs, and other officials without input from the colonial assembly. Town meetings, the foundation of New England democracy, were banned except with the governor's permission, and even then could only discuss matters approved in advance by royal officials. General Thomas Gage, the military commander who had been appointed as the new royal governor, arrived in Boston in May 1774 with instructions to enforce the new laws with whatever force proved necessary. Gage was a career soldier who had spent years fighting in America during the French and Indian War, and he understood better than most London officials the depth of colonial resentment against British authority. Yet even he seemed surprised by the intensity of the resistance he encountered. As ordinary colonists who had never considered themselves revolutionaries began to speak openly of armed resistance to what they saw as military occupation. The quartering of British troops throughout Boston transformed the city into an armed camp where every interaction between soldiers and civilians carried the potential for violence. The Quartering Act, the final piece of the punitive legislation, required colonists to provide housing and supplies for the very troops who had been sent to enforce their subjugation. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic consequences, as Bostonians found themselves forced to provide comfort to the agents of their own oppression. But Parliament's heavy-handed response achieved the opposite of its intended effect, transforming what had been a Massachusetts problem into an American crisis that united the colonies in ways that years of peaceful protest had failed to accomplish. News of Boston's suffering spread throughout the 13 colonies with unprecedented speed, carried by writers who understood that what had happened to Massachusetts today could happen to Virginia, Pennsylvania, or South Carolina tomorrow. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Wagon trains loaded with food, supplies, and expressions of solidarity began rolling toward Boston from communities throughout New England and beyond. New York sent wheat, Pennsylvania contributed flour, South Carolina shipped rice, and Virginia tobacco planters opened their purses to support their northern neighbors. The economic warfare that Britain had intended to isolate Boston instead created bonds of mutual support that had never existed before. More significantly, the crisis prompted the calling of the First Continental Congress, a gathering that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies converged on Philadelphia in September 1774, ostensibly to coordinate a response to the intolerable acts, but actually to begin the process of creating a unified American identity that transcended colonial boundaries. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams found themselves sitting together in Carpenter's Hall, debating not just how to respond to British oppression, but what it meant to be American rather than merely British subjects living in America. The Continental Congress adopted a comprehensive program of economic resistance that went far beyond anything attempted during previous crises. The Continental Association, as it came to be known, established a complete boycott of British goods, created committees of inspection to enforce compliance, and most dangerously from Britain's perspective, began preparations for armed resistance if peaceful measures proved insufficient. For the first time, the colonies were acting in unison, creating institutions that paralleled and competed with British authority throughout America. Throughout the winter of 1774 to 1775, the situation in Massachusetts continued to deteriorate as General Gage struggled to maintain order with insufficient troops and growing opposition from a population that no longer recognized British authority as legitimate. Colonial militias began drilling openly in towns throughout New England, stockpiling weapons and ammunition in defiance of royal proclamations. The dried tea leaves that still occasionally washed up on Boston's shores had become symbols of a revolution that was rapidly moving beyond the control of either colonial moderates or British officials. By spring 1775, the stage was set for the confrontation that both sides had spent months trying to avoid, but seemed powerless to prevent. When British troops marched out of Boston on April 19, 1775, to seize colonial military supplies at Lexington and Concord, they encountered not the scattered resistance of local troublemakers, but the organized opposition of a people who had decided that the time for peaceful protest had passed. The shot heard round the world that rang out on Lexington Green was the inevitable culmination of a process that had begun the moment those tea leaves first touched the waters of Boston Harbor, transforming a dispute over taxation into a war for independence that would reshape the political landscape of the entire world. A haunting melody of a condor bone flute drifted across the Supe Valley on a morning 5,000 years ago, its ethereal notes carried by desert winds that had witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations. The music rose from the stepped pyramid that dominated the landscape, where a priest astronomer welcomed the dawn with songs that connected earth to sky, mortal life to eternal cosmos. This was Caral, a city that would challenge everything the modern world thought it knew about the origins of civilization in the Americas, rising from barren desert sands millennia before the pyramids of Giza pierced the Egyptian sky, or the first stones of Stonehenge were arranged on the windswept plains of Britain. The Supe Valley, located along Peru's arid Pacific coast, about 120 miles north of modern Lima, presented a landscape that seemed designed by nature to discourage human habitation. stretching inland from the ocean like a brown scar across the earth. The valley received virtually no rainfall, its sparse vegetation sustained only by the thin ribbon of the Supe River that wound its way down from the Andes Mountains to the sea. The surrounding hills rose in barren waves of sand and stone, their surfaces baked by a sun that showed no mercy to any form of life that dared to challenge the desert's dominion. To most observers, this was a place where survival would be difficult and civilization impossible. Yet it was precisely in this harsh environment that some of humanity's most remarkable innovators chose to build their dream of urban life. The people who would create Caral around 3200 BCE possessed a vision that transcended the limitations of their physical environment, seeing opportunities where others might see only obstacles. They understood that civilization was not merely about finding the easiest places to live, but about applying human intelligence and cooperation to transform challenging landscapes into thriving communities that could support complex social, religious, and cultural activities. The founders of Caral were architects, engineers, astronomers, and artists rolled into one, though they possessed none of the technological advantages that modern people associate with monumental construction projects. They had no wheeled vehicles to transport heavy materials, no metal tools to cut and shape stone, no domesticated animals capable of bearing heavy loads. What they did have was an understanding of physics, mathematics, and human organization that allowed them to accomplish seemingly impossible feats through the coordinated application of human intelligence and muscle power. The irrigation system they developed represented a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering that would have been impressive in any era. Recognizing that the Supe River was their lifeline in an otherwise waterless landscape, the Caral engineers constructed an intricate network of canals, channels, and reservoirs that captured every precious drop of water and distributed it with scientific precision to agricultural fields carved from the desert floor. The system was designed not merely to provide irrigation during the river's normal flow periods, but to store water during flood seasons and distribute it during dry spells, creating a reliable agricultural foundation that could support a substantial urban population. Cotton emerged as Caral's signature crop, though not for the reasons one might expect in a civilization focused on basic survival. Rather than concentrating solely on food production, the Caral farmers understood that cotton could serve as both a trade commodity and a tool for technological innovation. They spun cotton fibers into fishing nets of remarkable strength and durability, creating tools that allowed them to harvest the rich marine resources of the nearby Pacific Ocean. These nets, traded to coastal fishing communities, became the foundation of a commercial network that connected Caral to settlements throughout the region. The agricultural success enabled by their irrigation innovations allowed the people of Caral to support specialists who are not directly involved in food production. Artisans, priests, astronomers, and administrators could pursue their crafts full-time, creating the conditions necessary for the development of complex religious, social, and political institutions. This specialization of labor, one of the hallmarks of true civilization, flourished in Caral centuries before similar developments in most other parts of the world. The construction of the city's monumental architecture began with the Pyramid Mayor, a massive structure that would dominate the Supe Valley skyline for millennia. Rising nearly 60 feet above the surrounding plain and stretching more than 450 feet in length, the pyramid represented an investment of human labor and resources that could only have been mobilized by a highly organized society with sophisticated leadership structures. The pyramid was not built quickly or haphazardly, but constructed in carefully planned stages over many generations, each addition reflecting advances in engineering knowledge and organizational capacity. The construction techniques employed at Caral demonstrated a profound understanding of seismic engineering that was remarkable for any era, but particularly impressive for a civilization operating without metal tools or written instructions. The builders used a combination of stone masonry and innovative fill materials, creating structures that were both massive enough to inspire awe and flexible enough to withstand the powerful earthquakes that periodically shook the region. They employed what modern engineers call base isolation techniques, using layers of different materials to absorb and dissipate seismic energy rather than rigidly resisting it. A workforce required for these construction projects came from throughout the Supe Valley and beyond, as evidenced by the variety of architectural styles and construction techniques visible in different parts of the city. This suggests that Caral served as a regional center that could mobilize labor and resources from a wide area, indicating a level of political and social organization that extended far beyond the city itself. The coordination required to feed, house, and organize thousands of workers over many years, while simultaneously maintaining agricultural production and trade networks, represents a logistical achievement that rivals the accomplishments of much later civilizations. As construction progressed on the various pyramids and public buildings that would define Caral's skyline, the city's planners demonstrated their astronomical knowledge by aligning major structures with celestial events. The Pyramid Mayor's orientation reflects careful observation of solar movements, while other structures appear to be aligned with stellar phenomena that would have been crucial for agricultural and religious calendars. This integration of architecture with astronomy reflects the sophisticated intellectual culture that developed in Caral, where practical engineering was inseparable from spiritual and scientific pursuits. The sound of the condor bone flute that had welcomed the dawn gradually gave way to the bustle of urban life, as Caral awakened to another day of building, trading, and cultural innovation. Workers carried baskets of stone and earth toward construction sites. Artisans gathered in workshops to craft textiles and ceremonial objects, and traders prepared for journeys that would carry Caral's products to distant communities, while bringing back exotic goods from the highlands and the coast. The city that had risen from the desert through human determination and ingenuity was becoming a beacon of civilization that would influence the development of Andean culture for centuries to come. The music of the flute lingered in the morning air, a reminder that Caral was not merely a place where people survived in a harsh environment, but a community where they had created beauty, meaning, and transcendence in the midst of one of the world's most challenging landscapes. The notes that drifted across the valley carried with them the dreams and aspirations of a people who had dared to imagine that civilization could flourish anywhere that human intelligence, cooperation, and determination were willing to take root and grow. Not a single arrowhead has ever been found in the excavated ruins of Caral, nor any spear points, battle axes, or fortified walls that might suggest a civilization built on conquest and defended by force of arms. In an ancient world where power typically grew from the barrel of a spear and cities rose behind protective ramparts, Caral stands as a remarkable anomaly, a complex urban civilization that flourished for over 1,000 years without leaving behind any archaeological evidence of warfare, violence, or military conflict. The absence of weapons in a society capable of monumental architecture and sophisticated social organization represents one of the most profound mysteries and important lessons that Caral offers to the modern world. The Golden Age of Caral reached its zenith around 2600 BCE, when the city had evolved into a thriving metropolis that served as the cultural, economic, and spiritual center of a vast network of settlements throughout the Supe Valley and beyond. The population had grown to several thousand inhabitants, supported by an agricultural system that had transformed the surrounding desert into a garden of cotton fields, fruit orchards, and vegetable plots. The great pyramids that dominated the cityscape were complete, their step surfaces gleaming in the desert sun like artificial mountains that connected the earthbound community to the celestial realm above. The leadership structure that governed this complex society appears to have been based on religious and intellectual authority rather than military might, a form of governance that was virtually unknown in the ancient world. The priest astronomers who conducted ceremonies atop the pyramids derived their power not from their ability to command armies, but from their mastery of the sacred knowledge that allowed them to predict seasonal changes, coordinate agricultural activities, and maintain the spiritual harmony that the community believed was essential for prosperity. These leaders were scientists as much as spiritual guides, using their understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and hydraulic engineering to solve practical problems, while maintaining their roles as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The physical layout of Caral itself reflects this emphasis on cooperation and communal activity, rather than defense and conflict. Unlike most ancient cities, which were built around fortified centers designed to protect ruling elites from both external enemies and internal unrest, Caral was organized around vast circular plazas that could accommodate thousands of people for religious ceremonies, cultural celebrations, and community decision-making. These sunken amphitheaters, some measuring more than 100 feet in diameter, were clearly designed to bring people together rather than separate them, creating spaces where the entire community could participate in the civic and spiritual life of the city. The religious and ceremonial life that flourished in these public spaces represented a remarkable synthesis of artistic expression, scientific knowledge, and spiritual practice that pervaded every aspect of Caral society. Archaeological evidence suggests that music played a central role in these gatherings, with dozens of carefully crafted instruments discovered throughout the site. Flutes carved from combor and pelican bones were tuned to specific scales that could create haunting melodies audible throughout the valley, while drums made from deer hide and wood provided rhythmic accompaniment that could coordinate the movements of hundreds of participants in elaborate ceremonial dances. The largest of the annual festivals appears to have taken place during the winter solstice, when astronomical observations indicated the beginning of the agricultural cycle that would sustain the community through the coming year. Preparations for this event began weeks in advance, as families from throughout the Supe Valley converged on Caral, carrying offerings of food, textiles, and crafted goods that would be shared during the celebration. The festival itself lasted for several days, during which the normal routines of daily life were suspended, and the entire community participated in activities designed to renew their spiritual connection to the land, the seasons, and each other. The music that filled the valley during these celebrations was not merely entertainment, but served as a form of communication that could coordinate complex group activities and create emotional bonds between participants that transcended the normal divisions of family, occupation, and social status. The acoustics of the circular plazas were carefully designed to amplify and focus sound, allowing a single flute player or group of singers to be heard clearly by thousands of people. This architectural sophistication suggests that the builders of Caral understood the psychological and social power of shared musical experiences, using sound as a tool for creating unity and cohesion within their diverse community. The trade networks that connected Caral to the wider world were built on relationships of mutual benefit and cultural exchange, rather than military conquest and tribute extraction. Caral's merchants traded cotton textiles and fishing nets to coastal communities in exchange for dried fish, seashells, and salt, while maintaining connections with highland settlements that provided exotic stones, metals, and tropical fruits from the Amazon basin. These commercial relationships appear to have been maintained for centuries without the kinds of conflicts that typically disrupted ancient trade routes, suggesting that Caral's peaceful approach to international relations was both successful and sustainable. The technological innovations that emerged from Caral's workshops reflected the same collaborative spirit that characterized the city's social and political organization. Rather than developing weapons or fortifications, Caral's artisans focused their creative energies on tools and techniques that improved agricultural productivity, enhanced artistic expression, and facilitated long-distance communication. They perfected methods for creating textiles of remarkable quality and durability, developed new techniques for food preservation and storage, and created a system of knotted cords called quipu that could record numerical information and possibly even narrative content. The educational system that transmitted this knowledge from generation to generation appears to have been remarkably egalitarian, with evidence suggesting that specialized skills were taught to individuals based on aptitude and interest rather than social class or family connections. Archaeological evidence indicates that scribes, artisans, and even astronomer priests came from diverse backgrounds throughout the community, suggesting that Caral's leadership recognized talent and dedication regardless of their social origins. This meritocratic approach to education and social advancement may have contributed to the stability and longevity of Caral's peaceful civilization. The agricultural calendar that governed life in Caral was determined through sophisticated astronomical observations that required cooperation between farmers, priests, and administrators throughout the Supe Valley. The timing of planting, irrigation, and harvesting had to be coordinated across multiple communities to ensure maximum efficiency in water usage and crop production. This level of cooperation required a degree of trust and mutual dependence that would have been impossible to maintain if communities were constantly engaged in warfare or preparing for conflict. As evening approached and the sound of flutes once again drifted across the Supe Valley, the people of Caral gathered in their homes and neighborhoods to share meals, tell stories, and plan for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow would bring. Children fell asleep to lullabies that had been passed down through generations, while adults discussed the practical matters of irrigation schedules, trade relationships, and ceremonial preparations that kept their complex society functioning smoothly. The absence of weapons in their homes and storage areas was not a sign of naivety or weakness, but evidence of a civilization that had discovered how to channel human ambition and creativity toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The music that had welcomed the dawn continued to echo through the valley as night fell, a reminder that Caral had achieved something that most human societies throughout history had failed to accomplish: the creation of a complex, prosperous, and sustainable civilization based on cooperation rather than conflict, knowledge rather than force, and shared prosperity rather than the domination of some groups by others. One morning, the haunting melody of the condor bone flute simply did not rise with the sun, and the silence that settled over the Supe Valley carried with it the weight of an ending that no one could have imagined. The great plazas of Caral, which had echoed for centuries with the sounds of ceremony, music, and communal celebration, stood empty as the desert winds swept across abandoned terraces and through the doorways of houses where families had once gathered to share meals and stories. The civilization that had flourished for over a millennium, creating wonders of architecture and social organization that would not be equaled in the Americas for another 1,000 years, was entering its final chapter with the same quiet dignity that had characterized its remarkable existence. The decline of Caral was not marked by the dramatic violence that had destroyed so many other ancient civilizations, with no evidence of conquest, rebellion, or catastrophic destruction to explain the gradual abandonment of this remarkable city. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a slow, almost imperceptible process of decline that unfolded over several generations, as the last inhabitants of Caral gradually came to understand that the environmental and economic conditions that had sustained their ancestors for so many centuries were no longer adequate to support their complex urban society. Climate change, that modern scourge that seems so contemporary in its implications, appears to have played a crucial role in Caral's demise, though the shifts that affected the Supe Valley occurred over decades rather than years and were measured in gradually diminishing rainfall and slowly falling river levels rather than dramatic disasters. The sophisticated irrigation system that had transformed the desert into a garden required consistent water flow from the Supe River, and even small changes in precipitation patterns in the distant Andes Mountains could have cascading effects on agricultural productivity throughout the valley. As water became increasingly scarce, farmers would have been forced to abandon marginal fields, reducing the surplus production that supported the city's population of non-agricultural specialists. The trade networks that had connected Caral to communities throughout the region began to show signs of strain as environmental pressures affected not just the Supe Valley, but coastal and highland settlements throughout Peru. The fishing communities that had traded dried fish for Caral's cotton nets were dealing with their own challenges as changing ocean conditions affected marine ecosystems, while highland settlements faced their own struggles with shifting weather patterns that disrupted traditional agricultural cycles. As these trading partners became less able to provide the goods that Caral's economy depended upon, the complex web of relationships that had sustained the city's prosperity for so many centuries began to unravel. The shift from abundance to scarcity created social tensions that had been unknown during Caral's golden age. As families and communities that had cooperated seamlessly for generations found themselves competing for increasingly limited resources, the egalitarian social structure that had been one of Caral's greatest strengths became a liability when difficult decisions had to be made about resource allocation and population reduction. Without established hierarchies of authority or traditions of centralized decision-making, the community struggled to coordinate responses to challenges that required rapid, decisive action rather than the consensus-building processes that had worked so well during prosperous times. The priest-astronomers who had guided Caral society through their mastery of agricultural and ceremonial calendars found their authority undermined by environmental changes that seemed to defy their scientific predictions and spiritual interventions. The astronomical knowledge that had allowed them to coordinate planting and harvesting schedules was useless when there was insufficient water to irrigate crops, regardless of seasonal timing. The religious ceremonies that had maintained community cohesion during times of prosperity seemed increasingly irrelevant when faced with the practical challenges of survival in a deteriorating environment. Evidence suggests that the population of Caral began to decline gradually during the 18th century BCE, as families made individual decisions to seek better opportunities in other parts of Peru rather than struggle against increasingly difficult conditions in the Supe Valley. Unlike the mass migrations that typically accompanied the collapse of ancient civilizations, the departure from Caral appears to have been a slow hemorrhage of population that left the city increasingly unable to maintain the infrastructure and institutions that had defined its civilization. The maintenance of the elaborate irrigation system required constant attention from skilled engineers and large work crews. But as population declined and resources became scarcer, The community could no longer dedicate the necessary labor to keeping the complex network of canals and reservoirs in proper working order. As sections of the irrigation system fell into disrepair, agricultural productivity declined even further, creating a vicious cycle that accelerated the city's decline and made recovery increasingly unlikely. The last generation of Caral's inhabitants witnessed the gradual abandonment of the Great Pyramids and public buildings that had been the pride of their ancestors, as the community could no longer support the specialized craftsmen and religious officials needed to maintain these monumental structures. The circular plazas that had once hosted elaborate festivals gradually filled with wind-blown sand, while the workshops where artisans had created textiles and ceremonial objects stood empty and silent. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final abandonment of Caral occurred sometime around 1600 BCE, when the last families loaded their possessions onto llamas and began the journey to more promising settlements in other parts of Peru. They left behind not a ruined city destroyed by war or natural disaster, but a remarkably well-preserved archaeological site that would remain hidden beneath accumulating sand and vegetation for nearly 4,000 years. A desert that had been temporarily tamed by human ingenuity and determination gradually reclaimed the Supe Valley, covering Caral's streets and buildings with layers of sand that would protect the city's remains for millennia. The irrigation canals filled with silt, the terraced fields returned to desert, and the Great Pyramids became hills that seemed to casual observers like natural features of the landscape. For 40 centuries, Caral slept beneath the sand, its remarkable achievements forgotten by a world that had moved on to other civilizations and other wonders. The rediscovery of Caral in the 1990s by Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady represents one of the most important archaeological breakthroughs of the modern era, fundamentally changing our understanding of the development of civilization in the Americas. Shady's painstaking work revealed not just another ancient site, but evidence of a complex urban society that had flourished in the Americas at the same time that the pyramids were being built in Egypt and the first cities were rising in Mesopotamia. The radiocarbon dating that confirmed Caral's antiquity sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, as scholars realized that the Americas had produced complex civilizations much earlier than anyone had previously believed possible. The implications extended far beyond South American prehistory, forcing a fundamental reconsideration of how and where human societies first developed the institutions, technologies, and social organization that we associate with civilization. Today, as morning light once again illuminates the restored pyramids of Caral, and visitors walk through plazas where ancient ceremonies once brought communities together in celebration, the site serves as both a window into humanity's distant past and a laboratory for understanding how societies can create sustainable relationships with challenging environments. The music of condor bone flutes may no longer echo across the Supe Valley, but the lessons of Caral's remarkable civilization continue to resonate, offering hope that human intelligence, cooperation, and determination can create wonders even in the most unlikely places. The silence that has settled over Caral is not the silence of failure, but the quiet dignity of a civilization that achieved something unprecedented in human history. A complex, prosperous society based on cooperation rather than conquest, knowledge rather than force, and harmony rather than domination. Though time buried Caral beneath the desert sands, it could not bury the inspiration that this remarkable civilization continues to provide to a world still struggling to learn the lessons that Caral's builders mastered 5,000 years ago.